All right, everyone. So today we are going to be reviewing together FPT7. So this is one of the practice tests that is featured on the HiSET website. And you have all taken this test. And so now I just kind of want to walk through these questions with you and give you kind of an idea of me whenever I'm working through the test questions, kind of what goes through my mind and how I work through it. And then I also want to ask for you to do the same. So without further ado, let's get started. So first things first, as you know, it's recommended that you read through the passage in its entirety. So for the tests, the way that they will present them is that just like this, it'll tell you the following questions refer to this section, and then they will give you a little bit of an overview about the section. So, after a class trip, students each chose a personal highlight from their visit to write about for a newspaper feature, read through the draft of one student's account, and then go to the suggestions for revision that follow. So for the sake of time, we're not going to read through all of this together, but please know that I have read through all of it, and it's my assumption that you have read through all of it, and that what HiSET recommends is that you read through all of this in its entirety before going on to the part where they break down the questions. So for number one, our class trip to the U.S. Capitol, Washington, D.C., the teachers insisted on taking us to the National Archives. Okay, so we have this part here with number one. Would anybody like to unmute themselves and tell me how they walked through approaching that question? What do you think the right answer is? And then tell me why.
Actually, I missed it. I chose D, but now I know I shouldn't capitalize the whole capital. That's why. So now I know the answer is C.
Good. Thank you for that. And you're right. The answer is C for two reasons. So one is exactly what you described. So in this case, capital is a common noun, so you wouldn't capitalize it. Obviously, Washington, D.C. is a proper noun, so that's why it gets capitalized in all of them. Another thing I wanted to call your attention to is also if you look at the comma placement. So in this example, they put a comma before Washington and then a comma after DC. So Washington, DC has to stay together. When looking at comma placement, we have talked about this idea of an appositive, where if you have a comma, then another comma, and inside of that comma, it's offsetting, modifying information. Then the way to test it is to look to see if you take the commas and everything inside of them out, if it would still work. So I'm actually going to do just a little demonstration for you here to show you what I'm talking about. If I would say Tammy, the president of the PTO, will be leading the fundraiser. Okay, make this a little bit bigger in case that's easier for you to see. So in this case, you can see I have a comma here and a comma here. So if I want to test that to see if the commas are put in the right place, then I take the commas and everything inside of them out and see if the sentence still makes sense. Tammy will be leading the fundraiser. Yes, that makes sense. So to me, that says that they have placed the commas in the right place. The president of the PTO is really just modifying information about Tammy. So it's good information to have, but it's not necessary in order to maintain the integrity of the sentence. So sometimes they'll put the commas in the wrong spot. So for example, if they put it here after of, say, well, I still see that I have the same pattern, comma, some sort of information, comma. So to test it, I take the commas and everything inside of it out. Tammy, the president of, will be leading the fundraiser. That doesn't work, right? So you know that you have your commas in the wrong spot. So you would want to go to the option where they have a comma in the correct spot. And again, you can test it by looking to see if you take the commas and everything inside of it out, will that still work? Okay. Yes, somebody has a question. Go ahead. I can't see the chat right now because I'm sharing my screen. So if you have a question, you can.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I forgot to unmute. So I just, in this case, DC has period, and I believe a long time ago I learned if we should have a period and a comma at the same time, I should abbreviate one of them. Is not correct?
No, there are some situations in which you would have a period and a comma together, and this is absolutely one of them. So in this case, you have a comma here because it is separating Washington and DC, and then in this case, DC is an abbreviation, so you have two commas, and then you have another comma here and here because it is offsetting Washington, D.C.
Okay, so I need a both period and a comma after capitalized C.
Yeah,
Okay.
but if you were punctuating a sentence, say, like if you wouldn't put a comma here, if it's it just depends on what the punctuation mark is what function it's performing in the sentence. So
Okay.
I want to give you one more kind of example about how to use these commas. If you say, let's take this example. If I say Target, the greatest store on earth, will be opening back up this Friday. Or we can just say opening this Friday. So you can see here I still have this pattern where I have comma, some sort of information, and then comma. So I'm going to test it by taking those out. Target will be opening this Friday. That makes sense. So that tells me that the commas are put in the right place. Something else that you can do is you can see if whatever is in between the commas, if you can replace that with what came before it, then that's in a positive. So let me show you what I mean here. Let's go back to our first example. If I take out the commas, everything inside of them, Tammy will be leading the fundraiser. We know that that works, right? Then if I put that back in, now let's say that everything that's inside of that, I replace with what comes right before it. So I take out what comes before it. The president of the PTO will be leading the fundraiser. That still works. So that tells me that we used our commas correctly here. Let's try that same example with the next. Let's try that same rule with this next example. So again, we're going to take the commas and everything inside of it out. Target will be opening this Friday. Okay, that works. So now we put them back in. And let's say that we make those what was inside there and replace it with what came before it. The greatest store on earth will be opening this Friday. That works too. So that's another rule that you can keep in mind when it comes to using commas to offset modifying information. The first thing that I always go to is look to see if I can take the commas and everything inside of it out. Does it still work? And if that's yes, and that's great, then the next thing I usually look at is if I take whatever it is that's inside of it, can I replace the subject that comes before it with that information? And if that works too, then double good. So in this case, if we would take out Washington, D.C., like they've done here, so we take the commas, everything inside of it out, it would read, on our trip to the U.S. Capitol, the teachers insisted on taking us to the National Archives, which still makes sense. So your answer here is C. Good job. So because Capitol is a common noun, it should be lowercase, and the commas are correctly used to offset DC from the sentence the same way that they would be used with the name of a state. So C is the answer. Okay, so now let's look down here to number 2. The teachers insisted on taking us to the National Archives, where the government's most important records are kept. Now, admitting at first that I did not want to go because a building full of papers and records sounded like a pretty dull thing to see. Okay, so how are we going to, this creates a fragment, right? So how could we fix that? What option from number 2 would be the best option to fix it? What was your choice? What did you say?
I chose B, but I just kind of comprehended. I just kind of instinctively, so I cannot explain why.
Okay, so now admitting at first that creates a fragment, but B is the right choice because it correctly joins all parts of the sentence to make it so that it flows as a complete sentence. So the answer here is B. Now I have to admit that at first I did not want to go because a building full of papers and records sound like a pretty dull thing to see. So now we're going to move on to the second paragraph. So in case you didn't know or weren't aware, these are where it has the little lines with the swoop on it, and then the little line with the swoop on it too. That's them referencing paragraph 1, paragraph 2. So that's good for you to know for organization of ideas questions. Sometimes they'll say, the author wants to move paragraph 2. Would it be better to go behind paragraph 4 or in front of paragraph 1? So you're taking this whole section until it identifies a new one is considered paragraph 1. This is all considered paragraph 2. This is all considered paragraph 3, just like they have it laid out up here. So we're moving on to paragraph 2. The National Archives is located near what is known as the National Mall, a long parkway stretching westward from the Capitol building. On either side were various Smithsonian museums. What do you think is the correct answer here and why?
I chose D, and I still don't understand why A is correct answer.
Okay. So in this case, the answer is A. There's no revision that is needed. This form of the word stretching, this form of the word stretch is the best form because it most precisely describes the long parkway, but it also maintains the present verb tense in the sentence. So if you're looking at the present verb tense, it's really a verb tense issue, and the way that they have it is the best. So if you say the National Archive is located near what is known as the National Park, along parkway stretched westward from the Capitol building, then that doesn't work because stretched changes the tense of this. There's a tense shift and it doesn't match with the rest of the sentence.
In this case, the word stretching is used as adjective, kind of, because it describes road, right? No, long parkway.
It's still a verb because it's describing what the parkway is doing.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear well.
So it's still a verb in this case because what is the parkway doing? It's stretching. So,
But but if so, we need to be verb for using a present progressive form, right?
can you say this one?
When I use ing as a verb, we need to use with be verb like is or are or something like that. I couldn't see that. That's why I thought stretching is not correct.
So in this case, stretching is the present participle.
So we don't need a be verb.
Stretching is the verb.
I mean is or are. Like I am studying.
Sure. So that in that case, am would be because your verbs are going to be your actions as well as your state of being. So am is a state of being, was is a state of being, were is a state of being, and stretching is an action. Stretching is what the long parkway is doing.
I'm still a little bit confused, but okay. Anyway, D is not correct. Anyway.
Nope. A. It's fine the way that it is.
Okay.
So stretched changes the tense of the verb, and then it stretches creates this word it doesn't belong there. I mean, if you would put a long way it stretches westward, then that creates a word that is not necessary. You don't need to have the word it there. And same thing with which is. So you in these other two options, it creates additional words that you don't need. So the answer here is stretching. The National Archives is located near what is known as the National Mall, a long parkway stretching westward from the Capitol building. So your answer is A. There are going to be some other verb questions as well, so maybe those can kind of help you make a little bit more sense of if you see it in a different context with different types of verbs. But after we're done here, if you're still having trouble with this, then we can definitely try to find some more resources and we can talk about it a little bit more. Okay, so if we're moving on to paragraph 3, when my turn finally came to view these historic documents, I lingered a little too long. When my turn finally came to view these historic documents, I lingered a long time too. I was unexpectedly moved. Before me were the handwritten principles that had allowed our country to operate according to law and undergoing change peacefully for 200 years. All right, so number 4, what do you think the problem is with number 4, and how do you think you fix it?
I missed it again, this one. Oh, if Nayaret, go ahead.
It's okay, honey. I think it's B.
Yes, you're right. Why?
It's supposed to be ing because it's stop. It's not undergoing for many years.
Okay, so this is the reason. Okay, so for the answer is B, and that is right. But the reason why has to do with parallel structure. So remember that we always want to keep the verbs in the same form, right?
Yes, yes.
So in addition to So we see undergoing is a verb, right?
Yes, yes.
What other verb do you see that comes before it?
It's according, to operate according.
There you go. Exactly. So to operate is the
Yes.
other verb.
Yes.
So you want to make sure that you choose the verb that matches that. You don't have the option to change to operate to operating to match it to undergoing, right? So you know that your anchor or what you're trying to match to is this to form of the verb. So you're going to want to look for something that matches to operate, which would be what you said for B, to
Yes.
undergo.
Yes.
So this has to do with maintaining parallel structure. You want to make sure that you look for the verbs that are going to align, that are going to put them in the same form.
Thank you.
Yeah, good job. So number 5, this is a spelling question. So this really, honestly, there's all sorts of A before E except after C, you know, so if you're going to go through that for all of these, then you can sure try, but my recommendation with the spelling ones is usually that one, a lot of it is just memory. So a lot of it, even for me, like I just look at it and know that that's how you spell that word, or that's not how you spell that word. And I have also seen kind of a shift more recently away from these spelling questions. I think that we are getting into a situation where a lot more people are using more software that has things like autocorrect on it. So I don't know if maybe that's why, but I don't have a whole lot of advice to offer you as far as the spelling questions other than what I've just described. And also, I always say, coming from somebody who doesn't spell very well anyways, if you miss all of the spelling questions and get the other ones right, then you'll still pass. So there's not enough of the spelling questions embedded in the test to make it so you won't pass if you only miss those ones. And from the HiSET people in general, they have put out literature that says on the essay portion that if you miss a few words here and there, as long as you've shown mastery of the other things, that's not going to impact your score too dramatically. So I think that there are other types of questions that beg more attention than the spelling ones. But in this case, the answer is D. So you spell, all the other ones are spelled correctly except for D. So signatures is spelled wrong. Okay, now let's go on to number 6. So we're starting on paragraph 4. On the day we visited the archives, a long line of people waited in the huge marble exhibition hall. The cases containing the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights were on a pedestal at the front of the room. One by one, people passed in front of them and paused looking. No one just hurried by. What do we think here for number 6?
I think it's
C.
C.
Yeah, good job. Exactly. So the answer is C. So pause to look. That maintains the past verb tense used in the sentence, and it also expresses the idea most precisely. So you would say one by one, people passed in front of them and paused to look. No one just hurried by. Very good. We're moving on to paragraph 5. To ensure that the documents continue to be well preserved, they are sealed in helium-filled glass cases. To protect the documents further, the lights in the exhibition hall were kept low. Okay, so what do you think about number 7? Do you think that you want to, it's fine the way that it is? Do you think B, C, or D?
A.
A, good job. So the answer is A. So There's nothing wrong with this sentence as it is. I will kind of take a little bit of time to look here about sentence structure things that we've talked about, though. If we want to break this down, if I say to protect the documents further, that would in itself be a dependent clause, right? Because we need to know what happened in order to protect the documents further. If we look at the next part, the lights in the exhibition hall are kept low. Now that is an independent clause. So if we just look at the first part of the sentence, then this demonstrates what we have talked about as being a complex sentence, where you have a dependent clause at the beginning, and then you go into an independent clause, and when you are situate your clauses in that way, then you put a comma before going into the independent clause. So to protect the documents further, dependent. The lights in the exhibition hall are kept low, independent. So you put a comma before going into your independent clause. Okay, but our sentence doesn't start there. But we do know that this first part of the sentence is situated correctly. So we can now in our minds think of that as independent. So everything there is the way that it needs to be, and it works. So we can think of that part of it as being independent. Now let's go into the next part of it. It says, and the temperature and humidity are carefully controlled. Okay, well, if I break this down a little bit, the temperature and humidity are carefully controlled. That's an independent clause. So what we have here, since we already know that this first part is the way that it should be, and so we're going to think of that as independent, and we know that this second part is independent, then we know that we bring together two independent parts of a sentence with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. So this, all in all, combines the complex sentence and the compound sentence, and it's called a compound complex sentence. But yes, I agree that you're right, that number 7, the answer is A. So no revision is needed. For number, okay, so to protect the documents further, the light in the exhibition hall are kept low, the lights in the exhibition hall are kept low, and the temperature and humidity are carefully controlled. Each night, the cases are lowered into a fireproof and shockproof vault beneath the building. In case of an emergency, they can be lowered instantly. What do you think is the answer for number 8?
You know, I chose A, and I know I mistook. So now I feel after in case is a kind of a different story. So I should choose B.
Okay, so if we are looking at the sentence in a whole, then this is really the entire sentence that is encompassed in what they're trying to test in 8. And as it stands, it's a run-on sentence. So we've talked about a couple different ways to correct a run-on sentence, and one of them being just to break it up into 2 sentences. So each night, the cases are lowered into a fireproof and shockproof vault beneath the building. That is a complete sentence. That could stand alone by itself, right? In case of an emergency, they can be lowered instantaneously. That could also stand alone by itself. So option B is a good choice because it breaks the 2 sentences up. It puts a period behind building to kind of close this sentence onto its own. It starts a new sentence with a capital letter, which is great. And then if you look at that, then you can see if we have this in case of an emergency, offset by a comma, right? So in case of an emergency is a dependent clause. They can be lowered instantly. they can be lowered instantly is a dependent clause. So also by breaking this up into two different sentences, then you've also created a complex sentence over here, which is punctuated correctly given what they already have here. So B would be the best choice for number 8. Does anybody have any questions about that, or shall we move on?
I just wonder, so where can I study about, I'm not familiar about the independent, dependent, complex, compound sentence. I can study maybe in a context, right? Content, right?
Yes, on Blackboard, absolutely.
Okay.
In Unit 2 and Unit 3, then we have lessons which I'll direct you to for sure after we get done here. Then I'll show you. I have pre-recorded lessons and exercises, and so we have plenty of resources for you in that regard.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so moving on to number 9. During our trip, we saw the nation's history reflected in many impressive museums and monuments. Much to my surprise, of all the places we visited, the archives turned out to be my most favorite. What do you think the answer is here?
I think it's D.
I think it's D too. What's your reasoning for choosing that?
Because they don't need to be mass. Just
Very, very good. So by saying the word favorite, that implies that it is the best of all anyway. So you don't need most. All of the other choices are just too wordy and unnecessary. Favorite is the most precise, and it removes the redundancy of the word most. So the answer to number 9 is D. Very good. Okay, so now let's look at number 10. This question concerns the draft as a whole. So this is why I say this is one of those organization of ideas questions. So that's when it's really good for you to have this. It's helpful to be able to see it just like this, not broken down. So if I look at number 10, it says this question concerns the draft as a whole, so the entire thing. For the best organization of ideas, where should paragraph 3 be placed? Okay, so if I go back up to the document as a whole, then something that I noticed as I was reading through here is that in paragraph 1, they introduced the idea of National Archives. And then in paragraph 2, they follow up with that. They explain more. They reference it again in more detail, but it was already introduced in paragraph 1, so you knew what they're talking about. So when I go to paragraph 3, it says, when I finally come to view these historic documents, I lingered a little too long. I was unexpectedly moved. Well, in paragraph 2, then what confuses me about this is this idea of this historic documents. Like, what historic documents specifically are they talking about? Because I don't know. When I go on to read paragraph 4, on the day we visited the archives, okay, so again, they're referencing back to something that was introduced here. A long line of people in the huge marble with a long line of people waited in the huge exhibition hall. The cases containing the Declaration of Independence, which I know is a historic document, the Constitution, which I know is a historic document, and the Bill of Rights, which I know is a historic document, were on a pedestal in the front of the room. Okay, so in my mind, what I'm thinking is that paragraph 3 needs to switch places with paragraph 4, because they are talking about historic documents here, but haven't referenced any of them. So I'm going to look for an option where it moves paragraph 3 to behind paragraph 4 and see if that even exists. For the best organization of ideas, where should paragraph 3 be placed? After paragraph 4. So your answer for 10 is going to be C. Does that make sense to everybody, how kind of my thought process in choosing C? Or does anybody have any questions about that?
Yes, I have a problem. I don't know how to switch them. And thank you for guide us, to walk through together.
Yeah, you're absolutely welcome, of course. What did you have a specific question about this question in general, or just a more, did you have a question?
No, I understand it right now. Before, I don't know how to do it, but when you read it, and yeah, it makes sense.
Good. Okay. All right. I'm
Thank
glad
you.
that was for you. You are very welcome. All right. So we have worked through our first passage. And so now we're going to move on to questions that are concerning a different passage. So for questions 11 through 18, then they refer to this following section. So a career counselor was preparing an information sheet about job interviews. Read through the draft, then go on to the suggestions for revisions that follow. Okay, so I can already tell that the tone of this is likely going to be a little different than the tone of the first one. So the first one was somebody's own personal account of something that they had experienced. This one is going to be more of an informational draft. So again, I'm operating, and so can you, on the understanding that you've all already read through this in its entirety. And I have too. So we're not going to read through all of it together. We'll just go straight to the questions. But again, do know that it is suggested that you actually do read through all of it before getting to the multiple choice questions. Okay, so number 11. Okay, tips for a successful job interview. In the days preceding an interview, there are a number of steps applicants can take in order to make a great impression. Step 1, research the employer. First, applicants should try to learn about the business or organization. Use the company's website as well as other resources to gather information about its products, services, who the staff is, and accomplishments. Would somebody like to take this one? What do you think that we should change? Does anything need changed? What's your input for number 11? Okay, it seems like maybe you found it helpful when I kind of explained my thought processing behind approaching number 10. So I'll do that with you again for number 11.
I think it's D, because it's just like it's kind of like the number. I think it's D.
Okay, so I think that the answer is D too. So I agree with you on that. The reason why it's D goes back to this idea that we are listing products in a series, right?
Yes.
So what they're saying is for you to gather information about the company's website, right? And they're saying these are the things that you should gather information about. 1, its products. 2, its services. 3, who the staff is. And 4, its accomplishments. Well, products, services, and accomplishments are all the same form of the noun. Who the staff is different. So in order to maintain parallel structure, then you need to keep all of the items in the series that you're listing in the same form. So if I look to my options, I know A is not going to work because we got a problem. Who the staff is doesn't match with the other things. So I need to find an option that puts who the staff is in the same form as the rest of the nouns that are listed there. What services it provides, staff. Okay, well, B creates creates a new problem that we didn't have before, but just with a different noun. So what services it provides isn't the same form as staff, products, and accomplishments. So B, you've fixed one problem with staff and then created another one. So B is not going to work. C, services, staff employed. Staff employed doesn't work for me because it's the same thing. It's redundant. You could either say staff or you could say employees, but staff employed doesn't work because of the redundancy. And then also, in this case, you've introduced this verb, which creates a problem too. So if I look at D, then I know that in my mind what I'm trying to fix is this problem, who the staff is. Well, D changes who the staff is to a noun form that matches products, services, staff, and accomplishments. So in that case, they're all the same. So the answer is for 11 is D, because it's the option that creates a uniform parallel structure in the items being listed. Yep, there a question?
You said the redundancy means a fracture?
Redundancy means that it's repetitive. It's over and over again. So like if you say,
Oh, okay.
the big, tall, towering man was really tall. Like you don't need to say tall and towering because you said it with tall or you've said it with towering, but you don't need it both. So redundancy means that it's repeated. It's unnecessary because it was already said once.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good question. All right, so let's move on to number 12. Okay, so we've moved on to paragraph 3. During interviews, applicants should describe themselves in ways that best show how well they fit the position. Nonetheless, be ready to provide information in the following areas: education and training, any former jobs, especially ones related to new positions. Okay, so I can see here that they are listing items in a series, right? Education and training is one thing that's listed. And since they used a semicolon to separate them out, then they kind of stand alone. Any former jobs, especially ones related to former position, strengths and weaknesses, past challenges, and goals for the future. So what I see here is that areas has a period behind it, which ends the sentence. So this technically creates this. Nonetheless, be ready to provide information in the following areas. Oh, did I skip? I did. I went on to 13. I accidentally skipped 12. Okay, I got ahead of myself. Nonetheless, be ready to provide information in the following areas. Okay, so can somebody tell me what you chose for number 12 and why?
So I chose B because we have to explain. I don't know.
Okay, so B is the right choice, so that's good. Let me kind of walk you through how I would approach arriving at B. because if you are able to understand the concept behind why you got there, that's going to serve you more in general than just, it just felt right, right? You want to root it in some sort of logic. So this is the logic that I am going about. So when I see this nonetheless, to me, my mind says, okay, that's a transition word. To me, that is a type of word that is kind of bridging the gap between two sentences or two clauses. So that kind of triggers in my mind that I'm going to go back and look at the sentence before that and then the sentence that it's part of and see how they're related. So if I say, during interviews, applicants should describe themselves in ways that best show how well they fit the position. Okay? So then nonetheless, be ready to provide information in the following areas. Okay, so if I'm looking at my options, I don't really like nonetheless because it's a type of transition word that seems to be indicative of a maybe a contrary relationship between the two things that it's trying to bring together. So I'm going to look at my other options and see if there's anything that is better for me. So for that reason, with the comma showing that it's used as an introductory clause, for that reason, be ready to provide information in the following. Okay, so for that reason seems to be indicating that it's going to provide examples, or it's going to exemplify, or it's taking for that reason. So for what reason? The reason is that you should be ready to provide something that tells why you're a good fit for the position. For that reason, be ready to provide information in the following areas. Okay, so B is the best choice for me so far because it best transitions the sentence before it to the sentence that it's part of, and the wording best indicates the relationship that they're trying to articulate between the two. So C, so why not be ready to provide? Technically, I think C would also be in the running, but the reason why I'm throwing it out is because it essentially does the same thing as B, but B is a more formal. The tone of this passage is much more formal. So why not? That is more informal, and it also creates this why not, like a question, which would mean that the sentence needs to be punctuated with a question mark at the end, which I see that it's not. So I've gotten rid of A, I've gotten rid of C, and if I say instead to me creates the same problem as nonetheless. It introduces this element of contradictory when what we're trying to articulate is an element of complementary or exemplary. So I'm throwing D out and I'm saying B for number 12. So I agree with you, Rumi, B, and that's why. Anybody want to take on 13? So I can already tell you that with 13, so I kind of had gotten ahead of myself earlier. The problem I don't like about 13 is the punctuation. And when I look at all of the options, I can see that essentially the punctuation is the only thing that changes within my options. So I know that what I need to look at is that punctuation mark and how it impacts the sentence or is used in the sentence. So by putting this sentence here, or by putting this period here, it ends the sentence. So the sentence is just, nonetheless, be ready to provide information in the following areas. Well, in the following areas, what following areas. So you can't just end the sentence there. If you say in the following areas, then you need to tell me what areas those are. So you need to you need to list some different areas, right? So I know that the answer can't be A because it ends the sentence where it shouldn't be ended. Any other ideas? Do you think B, C, or D?
What about if we choose C, because even though it's not ended, but it still continue, then to put education capital, I mean a small letter. I don't know. Seem like C would be the one option, I think. I guess.
Yep, you're absolutely right. C is the option, and it's because of these colons.
Yes.
So
yes.
colons, this stacked periods, basically, you use those for a couple of different reasons, but one of the reasons why you use them is to show that you're getting ready to list things. You're getting ready to introduce a list of something. So they said we already anticipated that we're getting ready to give a list of things, you know. So they're saying be ready to provide information in these following areas. So they're getting ready to list areas in which the applicant should be ready to provide information in. So colon indicates to the reader that yes, we're getting ready to go through a list of things here. So that's one way that colons are used. Semicolons, we know, can be used to separate independent clauses. Well, education and training, any former jobs, especially ones related to a new position, this is not an independent clause. So you can't use, and neither is this. So you can't use a comma to separate the two because neither of them are independent. And then or you can't use a semicolon. Yeah, you can't use a semicolon to then the comma doesn't work either. So the answer is C, and the answer is C because of the colon. So anytime that you know that they're getting ready to list a large item of things, then you'll look for the colons. That's what colons indicate. That's what they do. Any questions about 13? All right, let's move on to 14 then. Okay, so become familiar with the following frequently asked interview questions and plan a 2 to 3 sentence response for each. Okay, so what would you like to tell me about yourself? Applicants can talk about qualities, especially talents and prior experiences that make them a particularly good fit for the job. What do you think the answer is here? Any ideas on what the answer is for number 14?
I chose C. I know it's not correct, but
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Somebody else had something to say? Anybody else want to chime in? Okay, so I'll give you a hint, and I want you to try to look through the options that are provided, and then tell me if you can come up with a different answer, Rumi. So remember what we talked about earlier with regard to using commas to offset information that is modifying or additional. Use commas to offset information that is good to have, but is not necessarily vital in order for the sentence to make sense. Just wondering if you see anything in your options here that might foot that bill.
Okay, so I just I'm confused because of there's a that, but in this case, that means qualities.
Don't worry. First of all, the word that doesn't change in any of these things. So it's always there. So you're not worried, you don't need to worry about the word that, because you can tell it's the same here and it's the same in all of these. So if you're trying to arrive at the correct answer, then I would recommend that you look at what is changing amongst the possible answer choices, and then see if you can hone in on what has changed, and then go back to what you know about the rules of that particular skill. So I can see here that something that changes throughout is the use of the comma. So this comma placement is different from this comma placement. They don't have any commas here, and they're all different from the comma that's here. So if you're trying to focus on the commas, which one of these options do you think could maybe be best based on the things that we talked about earlier?
I think B.
Okay, tell me why.
Because the first, then you have to list, to make a list, like quality, comma, because if you say quality special, it doesn't make sense. You say quality, comma, special talent, and so it lists the thing. That what I see now.
Okay, well, you do use commas to separate items in a list, for
Yes.
sure,
Yes.
but they're not really listing things here. They're not saying applicants can talk about qualities, talents, facial features, clothing. They're not listing anything necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So can you go back to what we talked about here earlier, where we use commas to offset information that isn't vital for the sentence, but is good to have?
Yeah, I see it. I see it now. Because if you
Good.
remove this, one, it still makes sense. It's gonna be a full sentence. I see it now. If you say quality, that make them particular.
Yes, 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 exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So let me go take this over here.
I hope we take tests with you. You're gonna read it to us.
Okay, so here's how it is first, right?
Uh-huh.
And then you said B, which puts a comma after qualities and a comma after experiences.
Yes, yes.
So they already have a comma after experiences, so I'm going to put a comma after qualities. So this is option B, what's on the screen right now.
Mm-hmm.
And what you just said is exactly right, and exactly what we talked about up here. So if I take out the commas and everything inside of the commas, then we're going to see how that impacts the sentence.
Yes.
Applicants can talk about, what was it? Oh, that 14 came. I'm like, where did that come from? Okay. Applicants can talk about qualities that make them a particularly good fit for the job. Exactly what you're saying. Then that makes sense, right? But if I put it back in, applicants can talk about qualities, especially talents and prior experiences, that make them a particularly good fit for the job. So you've got commas here. They're offsetting this, especially talents and prior experiences, which is good information to have, but again, it's not vital in order for the sentence to make sense. Applicants can talk about qualities that make them a particularly good fit for the job. That works just fine. Applicants can talk about qualities, comma, especially talents and prior experiences, comma, that make them a particularly good fit for the job. So for that reason, the answer is B. And the other options, D is a run-on sentence. There's no punctuation at all, so that's a run-on sentence. And C, applicants can talk about qualities, especially. So if you went with C, then you're starting your sentence with applicants can talk about qualities, which is an independent clause, and then we know that we don't need to put a comma before going on to a dependent clause in a complex sentence. So the answer is B. Good job, Nairit. Okay, so let's move on to 15. Why do you want to work here? This is where prior research about the employer can pay off, enabling applicants to explain why they respect the employer and restate why they are a good fit for the position. Tell me about a time you made a mistake. How did you resolve it? Choose a mistake that taught a lesson. Emphasize the lesson. Talk about how it, in later situations, to act differently. Okay, so emphasize the lesson, talk about how in later situations to act differently. What do you guys think here? So one thing that I'm noticing is what we just talked about, where they have a comma here and a comma here. So if I take that part of the sentence and just isolate it, so this is just copied over. So this is exactly how they have presented it to you. Talk about how, comma, in later situations, comma, to act differently. So talk about how in later situations, comma, to act differently. So if I do that test where I take this all out, talk about how to act differently. In later situations to act differently. So when I do the comma test, that works. Emphasize the lesson. That is a sentence by itself. That's independent, so that works. So really, I'm thinking that my first instinct is it seems like it's kind of okay the way that it is. So let's look at the different options that they give us. Emphasizing the lesson, talk about acting differently in later situations. That is intriguing too, because although they use the commas correctly here, it still just feels a little bit awkward. So I'm going to try to find a way to combine it to have it flow a little bit better. And A, emphasizing the lesson, talk about acting differently in later situations. Okay, talk about how to act different in later situations that emphasize the lesson. With the lesson being emphasized, talk in later situations about acting differently. These ones are all just seem way too wordy. talk about how to act differently in later situations with the emphasized lesson. So it needs punctuated somehow. I can see that. B and D do not have any sort of punctuation. With the lesson being emphasized, talk in later situations about acting differently. Well, this creates a modifier issue because you want to talk about acting differently. You not want to talk about later situations. So this would need to be moved closer to the verb that it's trying to modify. So right now I'm going with A because although if you see the slight difference here, it says emphasize the lesson, which could stand alone by itself. With A, they've changed emphasize to emphasizing. So emphasizing the lesson makes that now a dependent clause, which makes this a complex sentence. Talk about acting differently in later situations. That works fine. That could stand alone by itself. Emphasizing the lesson can't stand alone by itself. So you use a comma before you go into any dependent clause. So the answer here is A, because it's the most concise way. It gets rid of this wordiness and conveys the idea without any grammatical errors. So most precise and logically combines the ideas in the two sentences without changing the sentence's intended meaning. Yep, somebody has a question. Go ahead.
So this sentence is an example of a good answer of the question?
A is, yes.
I mean, they are talking about how to answer for the question. Tell me about the time you made a mistake. I'm a little confusing. It is supposed to the candidate can answer when they got the interview.
You're just looking at the underlined portion and how you can combine those two in a more effective way.
As a correct example of answer, right? I mean, for the interview.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, number 16. You know what? I think that actually what I'm going to do is let's just take a quick break for now because we've kind of gone through a lot of information. So let's just take a quick break and take some time to go back and look through these ones that we've talked about so far. And then I will be answering chats for like the next 5 minutes. And if you have any questions, then you can send them to me in a chat. Otherwise, take 5 minutes to 5 or 10 minutes to review the questions, and then send me any questions that you might have, and then we'll come back and pick up with question 16. I'll kind of get a read and see if you guys are ready to move on or if you want to take some time to process the information that we've talked about so far. So go back, look over the ones that we've talked about so far. Send me a chat if you have any questions. We'll decide in about 10 minutes whether or not we're going to continue, or if you just want some time to continue to process this, and we can go over the second part of it in another class session.